What's going on, everybody? My name is Jordan, also known as JMonster, and I want to thank you guys for joining me for another Silmarillion video. I would like to announce to you all, first off, that we have a tournament starting on the 13th, so there's still a couple of days after this video will come out to you, that you'll be able to sign up, to find a teammate, and to play a few matches and try and familiarize yourself a little bit. We do have a pretty decent prize pool, most of which was donated, but it does also involve some Discord-related roles and being able to get into our alpha, not our alpha testing, but rather our closed alpha testing, and getting to see content beforehand and have a hand in shaping the mod as it develops. So that's pretty damn cool. But I thought it might be a good idea for a lot of the new people out there who aren't familiar, maybe even with Total War as a series at all, to be kind of immersed in like how the meta works, so that you're not going into the tournament completely and utterly blind. And this will also maybe be useful for people who are a little bit familiar with Silmarillion as well, and like have a fairly intuitive sense of these things, but not necessarily an explicit understanding of the way that certain units interact and like weapon types and things like that. So today we're going to be talking about infantry. I am going to release some other updates on like cavalry and artillery, but this is going to cover the majority of units in the game. And a lot of factions out there, unless they're the Sons of Feanor, Tolian Gaurhoth, for example, aren't going to be very cavalry heavy, so this is really going to cover the bases for the majority of factions and their rosters out there, which is why I wanted to get it out first and quickly so that you had some time to kind of experiment with it a little bit and get a sense for how things work. But yes, so today we're going to start with infantry, and the first category is probably one of the broadest. That would be the sword and board infantry, which is something of a misnomer, but it's nonetheless useful for designating units that sacrifice the offensive power of a two-handed weapon for the added defense or of a shield, or sometimes they carry no shield at all in the case of certain skirmishing infantry. These are by far the most numerous of all units in Silmarillion, but they're also, by the same token, some of the most diverse out there, so it does bear discussing some of the weapon types that we have. So first up we have the Axe Infantry. Axe Infantry benefit from greatly increased base damage and increased charge damage of about 25% at the expense of melee defense bonus. Axe units are at their best when they are able to take advantage of their considerable charge bonus. Most one-handed axes do not have the armor-piercing trait, and this is going to go for 99.9% of the axe units in the game. They do not have this. There is one exception to this rule, however, and that is the Thargellian Stalkers. This is a change that I made early on, and it was made specifically to help the Sons of Feanor when facing the Angband faction, and it would not significantly alter the balance of power in other Elven matchups. Yeah, the reason for that being that most Elven units or like Edain units tend to have pretty decent melee defense values. Sons of Feanor in particular can absorb or not the Sons of Feanor, Doriath and other such units can absorb the like 7, I think, in total if they're upgraded damage that a Thargellian Stalker can throw their way. So it's not really going to change things too much for units that have like 9, 10 and above melee defense, but a lot of the Orc units don't have that. They've got about 4 to 5. So that is going to help the Thargellian Stalker specifically against most Orcish line infantry units, with the exception of maybe some of their spearmen. Also worth noting that there are several different damage types, and I'm going to go over them a little bit right now. There's two main damage types used by units in our mod. The first is slashing, and that is by far the most common, and then there is piercing, which is used exclusively by spear units. Slashing units do get a significant bonus against units that use the piercing damage type, so this helps keep spear units down in terms of their ability to have brute power against infantry, and it does somewhat counteract the high melee defense and the very fast thrusting animations that the spears have. So axe units will use the slashing damage type. They're going to use the former damage type, and it's going to make them excellent against spear units, and it will just basically be neutral against other units that have the slashing damage type. So like longsword infantry, for example, which happens to be our next unit type. Warriors equipped with longswords have an average base damage score with slightly increased melee defense. With this well-balanced stat line, longswordsmen make excellent frontline infantrymen who can adeptly survive the rigors of combat. Longswords use the slashing damage type. They will get a +1 melee defense when I'm calculating their stats, so their stats tend to be, at least in melee defense, tend to be a fair bit higher than an axe unit of the same tier. And it's important to note that tier is also important in this, tier, training, that kind of thing. So like a high tier axe unit might have more melee defense than a low tier sword unit. But that's just kind of par for the course. These are more like general guidelines that will help see you through a lot of like basic interactions between units of similar tiers. Next up, we have Mace Infantry. Mace Infantry sacrifice a small amount of their melee defense for the armor piercing trait, allowing them to have enemy armor scores. It's important to note that this trait does not negate total defense value. So if a unit has 30 defense, it's not going to cut that total defense score down to 15. That's not how that works. There are several different stats that have an effect on melee combat in the game, and those being armor, melee defense, and shield. And I will do a video discussing the nuances of them, but it's important to note that armor piercing only affects armor scores. So one of those 3 stats. There is an effect from melee or from armor piercing missiles on shield scores, for example. They do appear to have them, but I haven't seen or done any testing that suggests that in melee an armor piercing unit will have the shield score of units that it attacks. So I don't know, so I'm not going to say one way or the other. But melee defense is definitely good defense against armor. So high melee defense units with heavy armor are not going to be affected the same way against an armor piercing unit as it would if you paired it against a heavily armored unit with low melee defense. So an orc unit versus like a high elven infantry, the interaction there is going to be different. So be sure that you know your enemy's strengths as well as your weaknesses, because that is going to be really important when determining how these matchups are going to work. Next up, we have Dagger Infantry. Daggers sacrifice a significant chunk of their base damage for extra melee defense, as well as the armor piercing trait. Dagger units are generally pretty few and far between at this point, and this weapon is usually a sidearm. For the most part in Silmarillion Total War, I think it's exclusively Green Elf archer units who use daggers as their sidearm. As such, Dagger Infantry are generally not suited to frontline combat, and should only be committed as a last resort or when they're out of ammunition. Dagger units have the slashing damage type, although that may change to the piercing damage type. It does depend on some testing. Next up, we have Spear Infantry, and this one is probably the most intuitive unit type out there for a lot of people. Spear Infantry sacrifice power against infantry as well as base damage for a significant boost in power against cavalry, as well as a sizable melee defense bonus. Spear Infantry are at their best when supporting cavalry, screening vulnerable units, or holding a line against hordes of enemies. While not deadly to most infantry, Spearmen enjoy fast thrusting animations and high melee defense, making them an ideal choice for your front line, or in holding actions to delay your enemies. Spearmen use the piercing damage type, as I mentioned earlier. In addition to these categorizations, non-skirmish infantry can be further divided into light, medium, and heavy. This is based on their armor score and has an effect on their movement speed. Now, the various different kinds of infantry are going to have different speed values, and I am going to cover that in this video. So hang on. The following is going to apply specifically to sword and board line infantry, not designated skirmishers, and not shock infantry. They are treated a little bit differently. But yeah, the base speed for Silmarillion Total War infantry units is 1.05. Heavy infantry move at this speed, while speed increases by 0.25 for every step they move away from the heavy classification. Medium infantry therefore move at 1.075 speed, and light infantry move at 1.1 speed, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is quite significant. So if you think about the dwarves in 0.96.1 Reforged, how slow they are versus everyone else was at about 1.0 for the most part, whereas dwarves were at 0.95. So that's the difference in that speed there. It is quite noticeable in terms of gameplay, even though it's not like a hugely inflated score relative to the base speed of heavy infantry. But that's going to do it for sword and board infantry. Let's move on now to shock infantry. And again, a fairly intuitive explanation coming up here. The shock infantry are the go-to damage dealers who wield two-handed weapons and crash into enemy lines with devastating charges. Shock infantry enjoy 125% base charge damage bonus as opposed to the 50% base of one-handed units. And they can be further divided into several categories of weapon types that mirror the one-handed weapons but are also distinct in some ways. In addition, shock units have their own base speed values, which are inherently higher than sword and board infantry. Their base speed is 1.2, which is decreased by increments of 0.5 by the presence of a shield and or heavy armor. Therefore, the slowest a heavily armored and shielded shock infantryman can be is 1.1, so the speed of light infantry for sword and board units. But this decreased speed is obviously offset by the greater defense that they receive. So it's a bit of a trade-off there. In addition, shock infantry charge at a greater distance than regular infantry and have an inherent +2 bonus against elephants, making them ideal for hunting monsters such as Uruloki. Finally, all shock weapons have the slashing damage type. So the first kind of shock infantry we have are two-handed swordsmen. Much like the one-handed sword, two-handed swords have an average damage score, but they increase the melee defense of the user by 0.1. And there's some other stuff that kind of goes into their stats as well, but I don't want to, give away everything about how the sausage is made. So we'll move on now to two-handed axemen. Much like their one-handed counterparts, two-handed axes enjoy a 25% increase to their charge bonus at the cost of melee defense. So overall, a two-handed axe unit will have a 150% charge, which is double that of the one-handed axe unit, which has a 75% charge. Or it's just about. No, it is double. Yeah, 150. Sorry, I thought it was 125 for some stupid reason. Anyway, I can do math. However, this weapon also has the armor-piercing trait, which does make it stand out from the two-handed swords, making it deadly against high armor targets, and most especially monsters. Doriath is very good, because of their two-handed axe units, at hunting monsters like the Uruloki. I do have a replay that will kind of show this off a little bit, I'm pretty sure. So, yeah, that's just something to keep in mind when you're making units, or when you're making army compositions, that two-handed units, and especially two-handed axe units, are very good at cutting down monsters. Next up, we have two-handed maces. Maces sacrifice a small amount of melee defense, less than axes, and have the average damage of a two-handed sword, but they also get the armor-piercing trait. Currently, the only two-handed mace unit that I can recall to memory right now is the two-handed mace unit in Doriath, which is the bodyguard of Mablung of the Heavy Hand. And next we have a weapon type that you don't currently see in the game and you won't see in the tournament, but it is worthwhile to note this because the Easterlings will be coming quite soon. And that's Falksman. The Falks is a weapon type unique to the Ulfang subfaction of the Easterlings. The Falks sacrifices base damage of -1 for 180% charge damage. They also do not get any penalties or bonuses to their melee defense, so they kind of just come out about average. And this makes Falksmen some of the most devastating shock infantry in Silmarillion Total War when they can activate their charge bonus. In addition, Ulfang's clan modifiers further increase the run speed of their Falksmen by 0.5, allowing them to close distances much more rapidly than other shock infantry. And they do have a number of medium and light Falksmen available to them, and I think one heavy Falksman in addition. So they can cover ground very, very quickly, which does minimize the amount of time that you have to skirmish against them, and it makes them really good for running down fast infantry units, like Green Elf. It's Green Elf. Green Elf skirmishers are a little bit faster than regular bowmen, and we'll go over that again when we get into the skirmishing types of units. But Falksmen are very good at running them down. Countercharging cavalry and things like that, so Falksmen, despite the fact that they don't have a bonus against cavalry, with their high charge bonus can be particularly useful against a number of different types of medium and light cavalry, and even sometimes heavy cavalry if they can get the right angle off in the game. So very, very scary unit, but it does obviously have some drawbacks. And that is going to wrap up our shock infantry units. I guess there is kind of a subtype of shock infantry There's like dual wielding units, but they will get specific bonuses based on the weapons that they have, and those are carefully chosen by myself according to what role I want that unit to serve. So 2 swordsmen, like a unit with 2 swords, will have a higher charge bonus, and they'll also get the melee bonuses of swords, but they won't have like the huge damage of a 2-handed unit. They're only going to get like a minor % to the 1-handed base damage, so they're not going to end up being like the end-all be-all. Like they do have certain advantages that they gain from having like melee bonuses from 2 swords, but they're not going to have their base damages combined and then factored in. That's not how that's going to work. Next up, we have Polearm Infantry. Polearms are the ultimate support units who derive their strength from their ability to pin the enemy in place and hold them at range, thereby preventing the enemy from retaliating while they're poked to death by a wall of spears or halberds. Polearm units may also, or actually they all entirely use the spear wall trait, which allows which increases their speed and also allows multiple ranks to attack at once. So if you're running into the front of a polearm unit, despite the fact that their base damage tends to be a little bit lower, you are going to be getting hit multiple times by multiple units. It can make them very effective, especially in the case of halberds, as we will see. Consequently, polearms have 1.0 movement speed to prevent them from becoming too fast, and this is largely because the spear wall trait does appear to make them, or the spear wall formation does appear to make them faster. So I had to balance that out some way, otherwise they'd end up being like almost a liability, as they would outpace just about everything else in your army except for your cavalry. That being said, not all polearms are created equal. The simple pecking order for the attack range of polearms is as follows, in order largest attack range to smallest attack range. Pikes are going to be at the top of the list, but they do have like bonuses and drawbacks, and we'll get into those in a minute. And then 2-handed spears and halberds have the exact same attack range, and they use the same animations. So let's talk a little bit about pikemen. As with all spear units, pikemen sacrifice damage in favor of melee defense. In addition to this, they also enjoy the highest anti-cavalry and elephant bonuses in the game. Pikemen are, however, the rarest polearm classes and use the piercing weapon, or the piercing damage type for their weapons. Pikemen only exist currently in one faction. The dwarves will eventually have them, but that's going to be, at least for the time being, it's only planned that those 2 factions will have pikes. So Finarfin, the House of Finarfin, does have access to 2 pike units that they can bring. But other than that, no one else currently in Silmarillion Total War has them. Eventually the dwarves will, but at the moment that's a distinction that only the House of Finarfin gets to bear. Next we have 2-handed spears. There will be 2-handed spears in the game, specifically for the Philathrim, who are going to have spear wall. Currently, the only 2-handed spear that I can think of off the top of my head, actually there's 2. One is for Nargothrond, and the other is for the Sons of Feanor. The Thargelion Huntsman, and the, there's like Nargothrond Stalkers or something like that. These 2 units are bowmen, and it's a little bit buggy to give them the spear wall trait. So currently they don't have it, but they are decent skirmishers, and you can use them as like a screen afterwards. So you just kind of use them like you would a normal spear unit. But there will be 2-handed spears in the game that have a spear wall formation and are going to be heavy infantry in addition to. Next, and finally, we have the halberds. Halberds are quite different to the other 2. Both of the other 2 units are spear units, so they have the spear penalties from the piercing damage type and from the spear trait as well, and they have all the bonuses and drawbacks that come with being spears. Halberds, however, are a little bit different. Halberds are a more anti-infantry focused polearm. They use the slashing damage type, they have the AP trait making them good against armor, and they enjoy higher base damage than pikes or spears at the cost of anti-large bonuses and melee defense. So they're a little bit squishier in close quarters, which is offset by the fact that they do have greater range, but against, like, say, a 2-handed spear unit with spear wall, maybe halberds will kind of lose that fight, but they'll be better against fighting infantry that can't strike back at them from ranged. And they have a little bit less of the anti-large bonuses, so not as much against cavalry and not as much against like elephants and such. In fact, I think it's quite a significant come down. It's about half the bonuses of the other 2 units that I mentioned. And then finally, we have skirmish infantry. Skirmishers are considered by the developers for gameplay purposes to be primarily brought for the power of their missiles. Some of the melee infantry from the sword and board section are equipped with limited missiles, but skirmish infantry do distinguish themselves in some pretty important ways. Skirmishers will have increased ammunition, smaller unit sizes, and the way that their stats are calculated is different, so they will have lower overall melee stats, obviously again dependent on tier and such, relative to sword and board infantry. The armor-piercing trait, in the case of javelin skirmishers, increased missile damage and missile range. Finally, skirmish infantry is capped at 1.05 speed, so they are going to be able to be caught by medium and light infantry. It's going to be easier to run them down with cavalry, so there are lots of drawbacks and perks to being a skirmish unit. One thing to note that I mentioned earlier is that green elf bowmen are slightly faster than other skirmish units, and that is to aid in the more kiting and fluid playstyle that the green elves can employ. But yeah, let's move on to our skirmish types. There's not very many of them currently. There's only about 3. First up, we have javelin skirmishers. The javelin skirmisher is your go-to mid-ranged anti-armor option. Their missiles ignore melee defense, have armor, and melee defense, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the big defensive stats against close quarters armor piercing that is negated by an armor piercing missile such as the javelin skirmishers. So they will have the armor value and the shield of the units that they attack. So this is a very, very powerful unit type for ignoring defensive stats. And as such, they are invaluable for inflicting heavy damage to tightly packed groups of heavy infantry, such as the Nargothrond pikes, for example. Javelin skirmishers are an excellent way to take a huge chunk out of Nargothrond pikemen. It really, really is very powerful. Javelins, it is worth noting, have some setup time and a fairly slow rate of fire, making them vulnerable while they wind up a volley. So you need to bear that in mind when you decide to employ your javelin skirmishers. You need to be able to give yourself time to get them into position and also deny your enemy time to react, because chances are, if they're paying attention, they are going to see them coming and they'll have had their eye on such potentially deadly units the entire game. Next, we have bow skirmishers. Pretty straightforward. Bow skirmishers are long-ranged, accurate, with generally high ammunition pools and a good rate of fire. These are the most common skirmishers in the game. They are best used harassing enemy lines and can deal significant damage to unshielded, light, or medium infantry. They can even do a fair amount of work against heavy infantry that don't have shields. So shock infantry in particular really do, at least they should, fear bowmen, because they can really take a bite out of their numbers before they're even able to get into close quarters. Yeah. Next up, we have crossbowmen. Crossbowmen are a rare and powerful type of skirmisher, being available only to factions with strong industrial capabilities and the innovative know-how, shall we say, such as Angband and the eventual Dwarf faction. Currently, only Angband has crossbows, however. Crossbows, is worth noting, sacrifice range and ammunition for very, very high base damage and armor piercing. Most crossbow units, actually, I think we only have one crossbow unit, and it's got about 6 damage. Or it's got, I think, like 8 or 10 damage base, but it's only got 6 ammunition. So it is very, very possible to run out of them if you're not run out of crossbows very quickly if you aren't paying attention to their ammunition pool. So you need to be careful with them, and you need to pay attention to what you're shooting and kind of conserve your ammunition. Crossbows, therefore, are excellent at cutting down cavalry and slow-moving shielded heavy infantry. Most cavalry tends to be about medium or heavy in the case of the Sons of Feanor, and Tolkien Galroth kind of runs the gamut from light to heavy, heavy and shielded. So crossbows are very useful against them for that reason. It's also worth noting that there is one unit of armor-piercing bowmen in the game, and that belongs to Doriath, and that basically follows the same principles as crossbowmen, except that their base damage isn't as high. But yeah, so moving on now to our last infantry type, we have the Monstrous infantry. Now, trolls, and at least for the time being Balrogs, are considered to be monstrous infantry. They have high mass, incredibly high damage values, and solid defensive scores to boot. They are best used to facilitate the collapse of stubborn enemy lines, or as crisis troops to help beleaguered warriors block enemy advances and potentially turn the tide. As they are classified as infantry, they are particularly vulnerable to cavalry charges and should be kept secure from the predations of mounted warriors, particularly those armed with a lance. Lancers can be very deadly against Balrogs and against trolls, especially if they manage to catch them from the rear, because they're going to completely ignore their high melee defense scores, and it's going to go right to their armor, and it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt like hell, and sometimes they have a chance to instantly kill these units, and they're quite expensive, so you want to be sure that you protect them. But as they are considered infantrymen, they can man siege equipment, they can climb up ladders and siege towers, and they can do all of the things that infantry can do. And I think they can also go up walls and stuff the way that normal infantry would do, even though it's preposterous that they'd be able to fit through the doorway arch. They're considered infantry, it's just how it is for right now. Balrogs may be elephants in the future. We are working on some potential implementations of that, but for the time being and for the purposes of the tournament, they are going to be considered infantry. And that is pretty well going to cover just about everything I think you'd want to know about the majority of the units in the game. This is going to go a long way to helping you understand the meta and be more successful in the upcoming tournament. So, that being said, if you guys are interested in signing up for the tournament, we do have 2 brackets available. There is 1v1 and there is 2v2. Currently, at the time of the creation of this video, we have 5 teams in the 2v2 bracket. It's going to be a double round robin, so you're going to play everybody twice, and then at the end, we'll tally up everybody's like wins and losses, and then we'll move on from there. The 1v1 is a triple elimination, so you have a best of 3 match with everybody, and if you lose 2 matches, then unfortunately you're out. If you win 2, you're on to the next stage. And that is open to basically anybody. As many people want to get into the 1v1 as possible is great with me. The 2v2, however, will be limited to 8 teams. As I mentioned, there are currently 5. It means there is openings for 6 more players. So if you guys want to get in on that, you better do it quickly. But yeah, in any case, my name is Jordan, also known as JMonster. I hope you guys found this video edifying and useful, and I hope it's going to help you if you're choosing to participate in the tournament. I hope it's going to help you be successful. And for those of you that are interested in Silmarillion Total War, I hope it has kind of given you some insight into the way that that the game is made. And it's a fairly complex system. There's a lot of interactions there. There's more to it, as I mentioned, than just like pure weapon type. There's tier, there's fatigue. Medieval 2 is an old girl, but it is nonetheless a quite complicated system. And it's really, really satisfying to learn these things and to learn how to play it and to kind of differentiate yourself, I guess, in certain ways from people who have just started. So you can tell the difference between someone who has played Total War before, but not necessarily Medieval 2 and not necessarily the mod that you're currently playing, just because there is that learning curve. So hopefully this helps make it a little bit less steep. But yeah, my name is Jordan, also known as JMonster. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye!